She tried to take his home over a flower bed, no joke. First came the fake fines, then the threats, then the lien she forged herself. Karen thought the HOA made her unstoppable and everyone was too scared to fight back. What she didn't know was that Michael was recording everything. Every lie, every threat, every meltdown. By the time she realized she was the one trapped, it was already too late. This isn't just karma. This is the story of how a power-hungry Karen lost everything she tried to steal. Michael moved into Maplewood Heights, believing it was the kind of neighborhood where life finally slowed down. After years of grinding work at a downtown law firm, he'd finally been able to buy a house in a quiet cul-de-sac lined with perfect lawns, matching mailboxes and wide oak trees that draped over the sidewalks like guardians. It looked safe, clean, a place where children could play and neighbors waved with polite smiles. But like every place polished too perfectly on the outside, rot festered just beneath the surface, and that rot had a name: the Karen neighbor. At first, Michael thought she was simply nosy. A short woman with sharp cheekbones, a permanent scowl etched into her face, and a clipboard always tucked beneath her arm. She introduced herself the day he moved in, not with a welcome basket, but with a lecture on Maplewood standards and the importance of following the HOA's every bylaw. Michael remembered how she scanned his lawn, tapping her pen against the clipboard as though already hunting for a violation. It was unsettling, but he laughed it off. After all, he was a lawyer. Rules were his second language. What harm could an HOA possibly do? He soon learned that in Maplewood Heights, rules were not guidelines. They were weapons. The first notice came only 2 weeks after he settled in. A yellow slip taped to his door. Violation. Improper placement of garbage bins. Michael frowned. He had set the bins at the curb like every other house on the street. He even checked twice. But Karen had written the complaint herself, and because she sat on the HOA board, the fine was non-negotiable. $50 gone, just like that. He paid, annoyed but not yet alarmed. Everyone made mistakes, he told himself. Then came the second notice. His grass apparently was 1 inch above regulation length, another $50 fine. The third for leaving his porch light on past midnight. The fourth for planting flowers that did not conform to the neighborhood's color scheme. Michael realized quickly this wasn't about mistakes. This was war, and the Karen neighbor was sharpening her claws. Michael's irritation hardened into anger when he noticed something strange. Other houses violated the same rules. Grass too long, bins left out, porch lights glowing late. Yet none of them received warnings, only him. He was the target, singled out from the rest, stalked by a neighbor who smiled smugly when she saw him collecting notices from his mailbox. The harassment escalated. Karen began pacing the street like a predator, snapping photos of his property with her phone. She scribbled on her clipboard whenever a car parked in front of his house, even if it wasn't his. Then she'd send letters demanding fines for unauthorized guests. Michael's blood boiled. He knew harassment when he saw it. He also knew that if she wanted to play legal games, she was challenging the wrong man. Still, part of him wondered why. Why target him? He was quiet, respectful, and paid his dues on time. He hadn't thrown wild parties, hadn't argued with neighbors, hadn't done anything to stir trouble. Yet here was Karen, circling like a vulture, using the HOA like her personal weapon. The answer came one late evening, whispered by another neighbor, a man named Robert who lived across the street. They stood together near the mailboxes as Robert leaned closer, voice hushed. "She doesn't like outsiders," Robert muttered. "Anyone new, anyone who doesn't bend the knee to her? You bought the biggest house on the block, didn't you? That's all it takes. She'll bleed you dry until you move, or until she takes your property through liens. She's done it before." Michael's stomach tightened. He remembered reading about HOA liens, how unpaid fines could stack up, how homes could be seized. It sounded absurd, but Robert's eyes were grim. This wasn't paranoia. This was a pattern. And Michael realized the stakes were far higher than a few petty fines. If Karen got her way, she could strip him of everything. The next morning, Michael found a letter waiting in his mailbox. Not taped to the door this time, official letterhead. stamped by the Maplewood Heights HOA. The words made his jaw clench. Notice of lien intent. Due to repeated violations and unpaid fines, the HOA reserves the right to place a lien on your property if dues are not satisfied in full within 30 days. Michael's fists tightened around the paper. He had paid every fine so far down to the last cent. This wasn't incompetence. This was fabricated, fraud. The HOA board, led by Karen, was trying to strip him of his home, his sanctuary, his years of labor and sacrifice. That night, Michael sat in his study, the notice spread out before him, lit only by the glow of his desk lamp. Rage simmered in his chest, but it was the cold, calculating kind. He was no stranger to dirty legal tactics. He had fought corrupt corporations in court, shredded liars on the stand, and watched smug executives crumble when the truth was dragged into the light. If Karen wanted to play this game, she had chosen her opponent poorly. He began building a file. Every notice, every fine, every photo. He cataloged the letters, saved emails, and documented every moment Karen trespassed onto his property. He even installed discreet cameras, capturing her midnight patrols and obsessive surveillance. Each file, each image, each timestamp was a weapon, evidence he would unleash when the time was right. But he also knew this battle wouldn't be won quietly. HOAs thrived on intimidation, on the silence of homeowners too afraid to fight. If he struck back, he'd have to strike hard, strike public, and strike in a way that could not be buried by Karen's lies. As the days ticked by, Michael felt the neighborhood's eyes on him. Some sympathetic, others fearful. Karen strutted around as though she already owned his property, her heels clicking against the pavement like war drums. But Michael was no longer intimidated. This was no longer harassment. It was the opening move of a war. And Michael had already decided he would not just defend his home. He would destroy the Karen neighbor, expose her corruption, drag the HOA through fire, and make Maplewood Heights a battlefield where only one side would walk away unscathed. For years, Karen had used fear to control this neighborhood. She had manipulated the bylaws, twisted the rules, and silenced dissent with fines and liens. But Michael was not the type to break. He was the type to burn his enemies down to ash. And so, as the first month of his new life in Maplewood Heights ended, Michael smiled for the first time since moving in. Because he wasn't just a homeowner under attack. He was a soldier preparing for war, and Karen had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. Michael woke early the next morning with a single thought: documentation. The lie that Karen and the HOA had tried to lay over his life could only be stripped away with proof, clear, time-stamped, undeniable proof. It was a truth every lawyer knew. Accusations die when faced with evidence. So Michael set to work like a man sharpening tools for a long campaign. He began with the cameras. Small, professional-grade devices were placed where they would be invisible yet comprehensive. One hidden beneath the eaves pointing towards the front gate, another tucked behind a garden stone aimed at the driveway, and a third masked as a decorative lantern overlooking the side yard. He tested angles, checked timestamps, and verified cloud backups. Each camera recorded in HD, encrypted, and uploaded to multiple secure servers so that nothing could be deleted by a vindictive neighbor or a complacent HOA secretary. The first few nights, the footage showed only the sleepy street. A late jogger, an empty delivery truck, the distant hum of a lawnmower. But on the fourth night, his patience yielded results. There she was, Karen, moving like a shadow across his lawn at 2:13 a.m., flashlight in one hand, clipboard bouncing against her side. She stopped at the flower bed Michael had arranged the week before and crouched, angling her phone for pictures as if she were an art critic. When she finished, she straightened and peered at the house with a slow, satisfied nod, then slipped off the property and disappeared into the darkness. The timestamp read 2:13:42 a.m. This was not the behavior of a concerned neighbor. It was surveillance. It was calculated. It was harassment. Michael printed the stills, made copies, and labeled them meticulously. He compiled a chronology that began with the first yellow slip taped to his door and extended through the most recent lien notice. For each entry, he added context: who delivered it, who signed it, and whether the fine matched any verifiable violation. The pattern emerged without surprise. Karen's name was on dozens of complaints, many of them questionable or contradictory. Worse, board meeting minutes he managed to obtain, old, dusty PDFs from the HOA website, showed a pattern of selective enforcement and an uncomfortably cozy relationship between Karen and the association's treasurer, but evidence alone would not be enough. Michael understood the psychology of a neighborhood. People feared confrontation and preferred the safety of numbers. If he could find even a few neighbors willing to speak, the illusion of Karen's omnipotence could begin to crack. He started with small, discreet conversations. At the post office, at the coffee shop, at the community playground, he asked, listened, and recorded. He did not brandish cameras or legal threats. He offered empathy and asked whether they had ever received fines or seen suspicious behavior from the HOA. The answers were a patchwork of fear and relief. One elderly couple admitted they had been assessed bogus fines and paid rather than fight. A young mother whispered about a hostile letter left on her doorstep after a landscaping choice. The mailman mentioned the frequency with which Karen reported minor infractions. None wanted confrontation, but many wanted privacy and justice. The breakthrough came from a surprising corner. The HOA's volunteer gardener, a quiet man named Luis, who had worked for the neighborhood for years. Michael approached him with a polite handshake and an offer. If Luis would speak honestly about what he had seen, Michael would ensure his name remained out of public filings and would help him obtain a small stipend to replace old equipment. Luis hesitated, visibly fearing reprisal. Then his voice broke with a single sentence that changed everything. "She's been rigging violations to push people out who don't do what she wants. She keeps a list?" Luis produced a slim folder, its pages worn from frequent handling. Inside were notes, dates, addresses, and shorthand comments that matched the notices Michael had received. It had Karen's handwriting in the margins. With Luis's cooperation, Michael's file transformed from circumstantial to damning. There were receipts for petty fines that never went into the HOA's ledger, emails showing the treasurer responding to Karen's messages with alarming speed, and a cache of voicemails left by board members who feared Karen's wrath if they failed to act. All of it painted the same ugly picture, a woman who weaponized bylaws to control property and people. Michael knew that once he had enough to show a pattern, the next step would be legal. But he did not want to immediately file suit. The public nature of litigation could backfire if he moved too soon. The HOA could hire a slick attorney, spin the narrative, and drown him in motions. So he chose a different tactic first, an information strike. He hired an independent auditor to comb through the HOA's books and identify discrepancies. He quietly requested public records, municipal permits, and calls for lien histories under state transparency rules. Everything was logged, everything was cross-referenced, and slowly the house of cards began to tremble. At the same time, Michael launched a quieter campaign to rebuild trust with neighbors. He hosted an informal barbecue, a simple afternoon with grilled food and neutral conversation, deliberately inviting people who had been quiet. He never mentioned fines or lawsuits. Instead, he listened about kids' schedules, about faulty streetlights, about weekend noise. In casual conversations, he left subtle breadcrumbs. Casual mentions of his legal background, offhand comments about how he loved to help neighbors navigate paperwork. People began to see him not as an antagonistic newcomer, but as a resource. As the afternoon sun dipped, several attendees lingered, offering to come forward if needed. The firewall Karen had built around herself started to crack, yet Karen was not idle. She sensed a shifting tide and reacted with the only tools she had left: secrecy and deflection. She organized an emergency HOA call, framed as a community safety review, and circulated a glossy flyer warning residents about unauthorized surveillance and privacy invasion. The flyer featured a grainy screenshot, one of Michael's own camera views cropped to hide the timestamp and context. The message was clear. Michael was the aggressor, the neighborhood vigilante. She urged residents to support the HOA and to be wary of outsiders. It was a dangerous play. If it worked, Michael's carefully collected evidence could be dismissed as part of a personal vendetta. He did not panic. Instead, he documented the flyer. He saved copies, tracked distribution routes, and asked the printer for its invoice. The printer, an apologetic young woman, admitted that while she had printed the flyer, she had never been told the full story. She signed a short affidavit confirming the order details and payment method used by the HOA. The subtle threads Michael had woven: cameras, neighbors' stories, Luis's folder, the auditor's preliminary findings, and now the printer's affidavit, were converging into a coherent narrative that linked Karen directly to the manipulative actions. As autumn crept into Maplewood Heights, leaves turning to amber and gold, Michael prepared the next phase. He would not be the angry homeowner tilting at windmills. He would be the man who dismantled a corrupt machine piece by piece. He scheduled a private meeting with the HOA president, someone he had identified as more impressionable than malevolent, and prepared to present a compact of facts, not accusations. He also scheduled a meeting with a trusted media contact, careful to keep the contact under wraps until he had more than rumor. Public exposure could be devastating to the HOA, but only if delivered with indisputable evidence. Michael wanted the world to see the truth, but he wanted the truth to be unassailable. Late one night, folding the printer's affidavit into his growing binder of proof, Michael felt the first flicker of satisfaction that was not born of revenge, but of justice. He had been pushed, poked, and threatened. He had been made to feel like a criminal in his own home. But the story that had begun as a petty neighborhood squabble was evolving into a reckoning. He had the patience to build it and the skill to present it. Karen's smile, which had once been sharp and sure, would soon be replaced by something else. Surprise, then anger, and finally exposure. He switched off the lamp, feeling the cool hush of the house settle around him. Outside, the cul-de-sac lay deceptively calm, the kind of silence that precedes storms. Michael slept not in peace but in readiness. He was no longer merely defending a home, he was preparing to liberate a neighborhood. Michael moved deliberately, like a surgeon cutting away infected tissue. The binder of proof sat on the passenger seat of his car as he drove to the HOA president's modest house 2 streets over. He had rehearsed the meeting in his head, not with theatrics, but with precision. Documents ordered, timestamps highlighted, affidavits sealed. What he intended to do was simple in its mechanics and devastating in its effect. Present the evidence to someone who still had a conscience and watch the house of cards wobble. The HOA president, a tired woman named Lien, who had once taught middle school and who still kept a soft look in her eyes despite the board's hard veneer, opened her door with visible caution. Michael's approach was calm. His tone measured. He did not demand. He delivered proof. The stack of images, invoices, and Luis's notes unfolded like a ledger of malice, each page a nail in the coffin of Karen's untouchability. Elaine's face, which had been polite and guarded, shifted through disbelief to horror, to a silent, cagey anger. She had seen the receipts, the printed flyers, the treasurer's rapid replies. When Michael mentioned the lien notice and the goofy flyer, accusing him of unauthorized surveillance, something in her broke, and old civic duty that remembered what governance meant before. Control replaced it. Elaine promised to call an emergency board meeting. That promise was a small, fragile thing, but it was also the first public crack in Karen's armor. Word of the meeting leaked faster than either of them expected. A few neighbors showed up outside Elaine's house before the meeting even took shape. People Michael had spoken with at the barbecue, the mailman who had muttered about the frequency of Karen's complaints, and Luis with his worn folder clutched under his arm. The neighborhood was stirring. Karen reacted like someone who smelled the air change. She accelerated her campaign with been here forever ferocity. Late one night, Michael found that the lock on his garden shed had been tampered with, his tools scattered, a spade left bent as if someone wanted to send a message. His compost had been overturned, and his mailbox had been smeared with a viscous, brown substance that required professional cleaning. These were low, brutish acts designed to intimidate, to make him doubt his safety. Michael documented every shred, photographed the mud-struck mailbox, and had forensics analyze the lock. The pattern was clear: petty sabotage designed to rattle, As Karen's sabotage escalated, she also pushed administratively. She circulated another letter to the community, this time a polished, urgent missive alleging that Michael had been conducting covert surveillance and that his legal actions were destabilizing the neighborhood. She distributed it door to door with a smear campaign disguised as concern. It landed in mailboxes like a contagion. But this time the flyer had a cost associated with it. Michael had the printer affidavit and the invoice showing the HOA's check. He also had security footage of Karen slipping between porches late at night, a clip that contradicted her narrative that she was a concerned, law-abiding citizen. The juxtaposition was brutal. Karen accused him of invasiveness while she prowled in the dark. Inside the emergency board meeting, which Elaine reluctantly called and which the treasurer insisted be recorded for transparency, the air crackled with tension. Michael did not storm the room. He presented the audit results, the affidavit from the printer, Luis's folder with Karen's handwriting, and his camera stills. He walked the board through each inconsistency, each fraudulent fine that had been levied on homeowners who either paid quietly or moved away. He emphasized the lien notice and the treasurer's suspicious accounting that omitted fines but credited special assessments in ways that favored Karen's agenda. The evidence was clinical and relentless. Board members who had previously been cowed by Karen's presence now looked at each other as if seeing one another for the first time. The treasurer, who had once replied to Karen's messages with quick compliance, fumbled for explanations. Small-town camaraderie evaporated under the weight of incontrovertible facts. Elaine, cheeks flushed, read a short statement about forming an independent committee to investigate the board's actions and temporarily suspending any new fines or lien actions while the investigation proceeded. It was an awkward, halting resolution, but it was a resolution, a check against the arbitrary power Karen had wielded. Meanwhile, Michael continued to marshal neighbors quietly. He did not trumpet victory. Instead, he focused on strengthening the network of reluctant witnesses. He arranged for written, anonymous statements from those who feared reprisal and helped them file formal complaints in a way that protected their identities while still registering their grievances. He advised victims on how to preserve evidence and how to communicate with the auditor. He coordinated with his media contact, but insisted the story remain locked until the auditor's report arrived. Public exposure without airtight documentation could be weaponized by Karen's sympathizers. Michael demanded correctness over speed. Suspicion, however, can be a weapon of its own. Karen attempted to strike back legally by filing a counter-complaint alleging that Michael had violated HOA rules by installing unauthorized surveillance and by disrupting community cohesion. She sought a restraining-type letter from a local attorney she'd found through a friend. It was a classic move, to freeze action by clogging the system with defensive motions. Michael anticipated the move and responded with preemptive legal measures, a demand letter to the HOA, and a notice of his intent to file for declaratory relief if the board pursued liens based on fabricated complaints. The legal exchange was terse and cold, a chess match played in formalities. The real turning point was not legal, but social. A previously silent family, kids he'd seen play on the sidewalk, parents who had once smiled but stayed neutral, submitted a recorded testimony about how Karen had approached them one afternoon with a list of community adjustments she demanded they make or face fines. Their voice, steady and unwilling to be cowed, was a damning piece of testimony because it mirrored Michael's own experience and showed a pattern. Once one family filed, others followed. The neighborhood, which had been fractured by fear, began to lean toward transparency and accountability. Karen's confidence began to wobble. Where she had once moved through the cul-de-sac like royalty, now she found herself walking past closed doors and averted gazes. She retaliated with whispers, claims that Michael was trying to ruin Maplewood Heights for his own publicity. But those whispers felt thin against the growing body of evidence and the quiet solidarity building among the residents. As Chapter 3 closed, Michael sat at his kitchen table once more, the binder thicker and heavier than before. The next steps required delicacy. The auditor's final report would either topple Karen or allow her to regroup. He had won small battles, an emergency meeting, a temporary suspension of fines, and the rallying of neighbors, yet the war was not over. Sabotage and legal maneuvers still lurked, but the tide had shifted. The Karen neighbor had gambled on fear and anonymity. Michael had gambled on evidence and community. In the dark, revengeful place that Michael's resolve had dug, the first seeds of a true reckoning were taking root. Outside, Maplewood Heights looked as pristine as ever, lawns like green carpets, mailboxes aligned, oaks leaning like watchers. Under the surface, however, an upheaval brewed. Michael closed the binder and felt, for the first time in weeks, the patient hum of justice beginning to stir. Michael had learned something important in the months since Karen had first declared war on him. Power didn't come from shouting the loudest or sending the most threatening letters. Power came from patience, from precision, from timing. Karen was loud. Karen was reckless. And that was exactly why she would eventually fall into her own trap. By now, Karen's desperation had reached a fever pitch. The preliminary audit results had already shaken the board. Whispers were spreading in the neighborhood about missing funds and misfiled records. The HOA president, Lien, was growing visibly nervous. And the treasurer, an older man who had signed off on Karen's vendettas without asking too many questions, was suddenly not answering her calls. But Karen? She doubled down. She always doubled down. One Monday morning, Michael found another envelope shoved into his mailbox, even though the HOA was legally required to mail notices through certified post. This one had Karen's handwriting scrawled across the front. Inside, 3 new violations. His lawn was not in compliance with HOA grass height standards. His trash bins were visible from the street for longer than 30 minutes, and his porch light, unbelievably, was too bright and a nuisance. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine was absurd, and each fine was hand-signed by Karen. It was exactly what Michael had been waiting for. Instead of tearing the notice up in frustration, Michael carefully slipped it into a folder he had been compiling for months. Every letter, every bogus citation, every little scrap of harassment, he had been cataloging it all in order with dates, times, and signatures. What Karen didn't realize was that her obsessive need to put everything in writing was building the case that would destroy her. But Michael's trap wasn't just paper. It was something bigger. That evening, he installed a small security camera at the edge of his property, angled discreetly toward the sidewalk where Karen often lingered. Another went under his porch light. A third, more discreet recorder was set up near the fence where Karen had once screamed threats about taking his house. Every device was motion-triggered, time-stamped and legal under state surveillance laws. And then he waited. Karen didn't make him wait long. 2 days later, Michael watched from inside as Karen strutted past his house with another board member in tow. She was gesturing furiously toward his lawn, pointing at the grass with exaggerated disgust. The camera caught every word of her rant. "I don't care what the bylaws say. If he thinks he's going to outsmart me, he's dead wrong. I'll bankrupt him before I let him stay here." Michael smiled coldly. It was exactly what he needed. Proof of intent, spoken in her own voice. But Karen wasn't done. The very next weekend, he caught her again, this time with a clipboard in hand, writing down infractions while muttering to herself. She didn't notice the camera mounted in the eaves of his porch. She didn't notice Michael's quiet satisfaction as he downloaded the footage. Meanwhile, the HOA board was starting to fracture. Lien, once so confident as president, was avoiding public meetings. When questioned about the audit, she stammered through excuses about clerical errors and misplaced documents. The treasurer had already confessed privately to a neighbor that Karen had pressured him into, signing off on fines he never believed were real. Word spread quickly. By the time the next community gathering rolled around, at least 3 families were openly siding with Michael. Karen, however, was blind to the shift. She stormed into the meeting, armed with her usual bluster, demanding that Michael's infractions be escalated to a lien. But instead of applause, she was met with uneasy silence. One board member cleared his throat and asked if the auditor's questions had been answered yet. Another asked why so many violations seemed to target only Michael's property. Karen's face reddened. She deflected, she snarled, she threatened. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Michael sat quietly through the whole thing, saying almost nothing. But inside, he was smiling. Behind the scenes, his trap tightened. His attorney had already filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Real Estate, which regulated HOAs. Copies of every fine, every violation, and, most importantly, Karen's recorded threats were included. His lawyer had also drafted a cease and desist order specifically naming Karen, making her personally liable for harassment if she continued. But Michael wasn't finished. He sent an anonymous tip to a local journalist who specialized in community corruption stories. He didn't give them everything, just enough to spark interest. Homeowner Association under investigation for financial misconduct and targeted harassment. The reporter asked for details. Michael promised more to come. It was a dangerous game, but one Michael played with icy patience. He knew Karen's type. The more cornered she felt, the louder she would scream. And the louder she screamed, the more evidence she created. And then Karen made her fatal mistake. Late one night, Michael's porch light camera captured her creeping onto his property. Clipboard in hand, she paced around his yard, snapping photos, muttering insults under her breath. And then, caught in crystal-clear video, she deliberately knocked over one of his potted plants, shattering it against the pavement. The camera captured everything. The timestamp, her face, the sound of the ceramic breaking. Michael didn't confront her. He didn't run outside. He didn't even call the police. Not yet. Instead, he downloaded the footage and added it to his growing arsenal. Another nail in the coffin? By now, the trap was set. Karen thought she was waging a petty war of fines and notices. She thought she was pushing Michael closer to the brink. But what she didn't realize was that every fine, every rant, every late-night act of vandalism was being documented, preserved, and weaponized. And Michael wasn't just collecting evidence for himself. He was building a bomb, one that would blow the entire HOA wide open. The board was already divided. The neighbors were already whispering. The auditor was already digging. And Karen? She had just handed him the proof of malicious harassment and vandalism on a silver platter. Michael leaned back in his chair that night, reviewing the footage again. Karen's voice echoed from the recording. "I'll bankrupt him before I let him stay here." Michael paused the video, his expression cold, determined. She didn't know it yet, but she was already finished. Karen had always been loud, but now she was unhinged. The audit had rattled her. The whispers in the neighborhood had rattled her. And the silent confidence on Michael's face, that infuriating calm he wore at every meeting, had pushed her to the brink. So she did what power-drunk bullies always do when they feel cornered. She escalated. The first strike came in the form of a letter, another final notice of Lien. Only this time, Karen had taken things a step further. The document wasn't typed in the HOA's usual template. It wasn't notarized. It wasn't even legal. It was a sloppy, half-plagiarized mess she had thrown together, complete with bold letters across the top. Final warning, property seizure pending, and at the bottom, scrawled in her signature handwriting, approved, Karen H., HOA board member. Michael almost laughed when he opened it. She had just put her own name on an illegal lien threat. That one piece of paper was no longer just harassment. It was fraud. Instead of reacting, Michael filed it neatly into his growing folder, then forwarded a copy to his lawyer. Another nail in the coffin. Karen's second strike was louder. That weekend, she blasted an all-neighborhood email, accusing Michael of being a parasite who refused to follow community standards. She claimed he was refusing to pay legally mandated HOA dues, and that his case was a financial burden on every family in the neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that half the neighborhood had already seen the cracks in her leadership. Many knew about the audit. Some had even started sharing their own stories of being bullied by Karen in hushed tones over backyard fences and late-night texts. Her smear campaign didn't build support. It backfired. Neighbors, started quietly forwarding. Michael copies of her rants. A few even apologized in person, admitting they had stayed silent out of fear, but were glad someone was finally standing up to her. Karen was losing her grip, but she wasn't finished. At the next board meeting, she unleashed her fury in person. The room was tense before it even began. Word of the audit had spread, and for the first time, the seats were full. Homeowners who normally avoided the endless HOA squabbles had shown up to watch the drama unfold. Karen walked in with a stack of papers and a fire in her eyes. She didn't even wait for the meeting to start before shouting, "This man is a disgrace to this community!" she screamed, pointing at Michael like an accuser at a trial. "He thinks he's above the rules. He refuses to pay his fines. He refuses to respect this neighborhood. And if this board has any backbone left, we will file for foreclosure immediately." A murmur swept the room. But it wasn't agreement. It was discomfort. One board member cleared his throat. "Karen, foreclosure is a legal process. We can't just—" Karen slammed her fist on the table. "Don't tell me what we can and can't do. He's destroying the value of all our homes." The treasurer shifted in his seat. Elaine, the president, looked down at her notes, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And Michael? He just sat back, arms crossed, calm as ever, because what Karen didn't realize was that the meeting was being recorded. Not by him, but by a neighbor in the back row who had grown tired of her tantrums. The video captured everything: her threats, her false claims, her wild demand to seize a man's home without due process. By the end of the meeting, Karen was practically foaming at the mouth, yelling at anyone who dared question her. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. And by the next morning, clips of her meltdown were circulating in the neighborhood group chat. But Karen wasn't done digging. She began showing up outside Michael's house at random hours, clipboard in hand, documenting infractions that only she could see. She screamed at one neighbor for parking too close to the curb, another for leaving a garden hose uncoiled. She accused the elderly couple across the street of colluding with Michael when they waved at him one morning. Each incident chipped away at her credibility. And every time, Michael's cameras caught her in the act. One night, after a particularly vicious tirade where she called him a criminal squatter from the sidewalk, Michael sat at his desk, headphones on, watching the footage. Her shrill voice filled the speakers. "I don't care what the law says. I'll drive him out if it's the last thing I do." Click, saved, cataloged, another nail. By now, the community had shifted. People weren't just doubting Karen, they were afraid of her. Mothers whispered about her temper at the school bus stop. Retirees muttered about moving away if she stayed in power. One neighbor confided to Michael that Karen had once fined him for having the wrong shade of mulch and threatened to sue when he argued. She wasn't a leader anymore. She was a liability, but in her own mind, she was still untouchable, and that delusion pushed her to her final mistake. One Friday evening, Karen showed up at Michael's front lawn with 2 other board members in tow. She was waving a piece of paper, shouting about emergency enforcement action. "This is it, Michael," she shrieked, voice echoing across the street. "I filed the paperwork. You're finished. By next month, this house will belong to the association." The 2 board members looked horrified. One of them whispered, "Karen, you can't just—" But Karen talked over them, screaming about foreclosure, seizure, compliance, rules. What she didn't know was that Michael had already called his lawyer earlier that week. And what she didn't know was that everything she was saying now, this illegal foreclosure threat, this public intimidation, this reckless abuse of power, was being captured by 3 different cameras. Michael didn't respond. He didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He just stood there, calm, hands in his pockets, while Karen burned herself alive in front of half the neighborhood because he knew the trap had sprung. The evidence was undeniable. The witnesses were many. The board was fractured, and Karen had just admitted on record to trying to seize a man's home illegally. As she stormed off into the night, waving her fake paperwork like a trophy, Michael closed his door and smiled. She thought she had won, but in reality, she had just handed him the victory he had been waiting for. Karen had always believed she was untouchable. For years, she bullied neighbors, invented fines, and acted like the HOA existed purely to serve her. But power built on fear always collapses, and hers was about to shatter. Michael knew it the night she screamed in front of the board and half the neighborhood about taking his house. That meltdown was the final spark. The fake Lien, the vandalism footage, the audit, the recorded threats. Everything was already in motion. She just didn't know the ground had already disappeared beneath her feet. Michael's attorney filed the lawsuit quietly but strategically. It named not just the HOA, but Karen personally. The evidence was undeniable. The fraudulent lien document she signed herself. The video of her vandalizing Michael's property at night. The audio recording of her bragging about bankrupting him. And footage of her threatening foreclosure at the board meeting. The case hit county court and the state HOA regulatory division at the same time. And because the HOA's insurance didn't cover intentional misconduct, she was fully exposed. Almost immediately, the board began folding from the inside. Elaine, the so-called president, resigned within days, claiming she had no idea what Karen was really doing. The treasurer broke completely, turning over text messages, email chains, and signed documents that proved Karen had been forcing the board to follow her lead for years. One by one, the people she relied on to keep her untouchable abandoned her to save themselves. But the legal hit wasn't the only one. The neighborhood group chat started buzzing with clips and rumors. Someone leaked the footage of Karen's meltdown to a local reporter. Within days, the article went online with her name printed clearly for everyone to see. Neighbors who once stepped aside when she walked past now turned away in disgust. Parents told their kids not to go near her yard. People who used to tolerate her just to avoid problems now ignored her completely. While the public fallout spread, the state audit wrapped up. Thousands of dollars in HOA funds were unaccounted for or misused. The board was officially dissolved under emergency supervision. New elections were ordered, and this time every homeowner showed up to vote. Michael didn't run for anything, but the new board swore to enforce rules fairly and put an end to the chaos Karen had created. Karen wasn't just banned from holding a board position. She was formally prohibited from involvement in HOA decisions ever again. The lawsuit went forward, and Karen tried to fight it with the same arrogance she'd always used. But judges don't care about yelling. They don't care about intimidation. They care about evidence. And Michael had all of it. The bogus lien alone was enough to destroy her. The vandalism footage removed any doubt. The recorded threats made her motives clear. The court ordered her to pay restitution, cover Michael's legal fees, and accept personal fines for filing fraudulent documents. The damage crushed her financially and socially. It spread through the neighborhood that she was refinancing her home just to pay the legal costs. People whispered about how she'd been exposed, how the power she used to abuse everyone had blown up in her face. Her reputation, once used as a weapon, became a warning to everyone else. She couldn't show her face at community meetings. She couldn't demand anything from anyone. The same neighbors she used to terrorize wouldn't even make eye contact. Within a few months, Karen sold her house and vanished. No announcement. No confrontation. No apology. Just gone. Michael never gloated. He never bragged or tried to rally attention. When neighbors came to thank him, he just nodded and went back to his life. He wasn't trying to be the neighborhood hero. He just refused to be another victim. He beat her the same way she tried to destroy him, on record, on paper, and with patience. She tried to take everything from him, his peace, his home, his dignity. Instead, she lost everything she used as a weapon. The HOA was rebuilt without her. The neighbors no longer lived in fear. And Michael walked away with what she could never take: respect, stability, and silence. Karen didn't just lose. She erased herself trying to win.